Thank you for joining the Florida Center for Students with Unique Abilities monthly informational webinar, Eligibility for Opportunity, How Students Enter Florida Post-Secondary Comprehensive Transition Programs. My name is Drew Andrews. I am the Assistant Director and Technical Assistance Coordinator at the Florida Center for Students with Unique Abilities. Our presenters today are Amanda Warren, Program Coordinator, Tallahassee Community College Eagle Connections Program. And from, excuse me, let me admit a couple of people here. I just don't want folks to be sitting in the waiting room. And Doug Carothers. Doug is a professor of special education and the principal investigator for the Soaring Eagle Academy at Florida Gulf Coast University. This webinar is being recorded. Handouts can be downloaded from the chat section, which can be accessed by clicking on the little chat icon that you see or the speech bubble down at the bottom of your browser window. If you're having difficulty hearing the presentation, phone numbers that can be used to call and join the audio via phone while following the slides online will also be posted in the chat window. Welcome everyone, and at this time I'm going to turn it over to Amanda and Doug.
All right, I guess I'm going to start, and I'd like to start by thanking Janice and Drew for providing the opportunity to do this, because it gave me a couple of real good benefits. And one was it gave me the incentive to look into some things that I'd not looked into in as great a detail before, like the Higher Education Opportunity Act and the Florida Post-Secondary Comprehensive Transition Act, to actually read the laws. And that's really valuable to do if you've never done that. But the other thing it did was, I've always prided myself on being a team player. It gave me the opportunity to meet a colleague from the northern part of the state, up in the Panhandle, that really just is amazing. Amanda has done a great job of taking the ball and running with this. And it's been a real pleasure working with her. And I don't know how I would have gotten the opportunity to meet her otherwise. So I'm very happy for that too. And if we can move on to the first slide, I'll do what I do best, which is talk without being interrupted. Let's start off looking at what is the basis for programs like this, but I'd like to go back even a little bit before the K-12 legislation. And that is because individuals with intellectual disabilities have always had a place in the very forefront of education and civil rights law. And it goes back to the litigation that preceded the legislation in 1972. Well, if you go back to the 50s, you had Brown versus the Board of Education, and that laid the civil rights basis for not excluding people from education. And then in 1972, Park versus the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania made it illegal for school districts in that jurisdiction to exclude kids with intellectual disabilities. And they said if they were going to educate one, they have to educate all, and they should educate them in the regular classroom or the next most appropriate environment. And that led to the 1972 case of Mills versus the Deep Sea Board of Education that extended this right to people with other disabilities. And it relates to something that if I remember, I'll mention in just a minute when it's appropriate in the law, about eligibility versus entitlement. In those cases, they said in the Park case, they said that intellectual disability was a personal characteristic. It's unalterable, and it made people to be treated by a suspect class, and that was found illegal. So that was the same argument as used in Brown. Well, this led to 1974 passage. In 1975, it was signed into law of Educational Public Law 94-142, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which is now known as the Individuals with Disability Education Improvement Act. And it had 6 key components. And one of those is zero reject or free appropriate public education, meaning that our K-12 schools no longer had the right to exclude anybody from receiving a public education. It also required them to provide individualized education programs, place students in the least restrictive environment, engage in non-discriminatory assessment, provided parental safeguards, procedural safeguards, and parental rights. But it extended the right for educational services within the K-12 system, but it did not go anywhere beyond that. But some of those features of that, again, are really critically important. Over time, was reauthorized, I believe, if check my memory, for those of you that are special ed folks, which is about all of you, it was reauthorized in 1990, 1997. In 1990, we added the transition component, the requirement for transition planning to the law. 1997, it was reauthorized again. And in 2004, it was reauthorized. And throughout that whole time, the age ranges and everything about it is striven to make the law more inclusive, to provide better educational services for students with disabilities. However, it did not provide anything for students with intellectual disabilities or any other type of disability wanting to move on to post-secondary education. The Federal Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Section 504, that was federal civil rights legislation. And I'm going to come back to that in just a second on the next slide, or the one after that. But it was the first disability civil rights law to be specifically enacted in the US. If we can move to the next slide, please, Amanda. Higher education, and if you'll forgive me, I have a hard enough time looking at the camera instead of the screen, but I also, because I did some research, I'd like to read this to you, some of the stuff that I learned about the Higher Ed Opportunity Act. First is, it defined students with intellectual disabilities. It defined comprehensive transition and post-secondary programs for students with intellectual disabilities. And let's see, it said that students with an intellectual disability shall A, be enrolled or accepted for enrollment in a comprehensive transition and post-secondary program for students with intellectual disabilities at an institution of higher education. B, that they would maintain satisfactory progress in the program as determined by the institution, and it made the students eligible for financial assistance. Then it defined what a comprehensive transition and post-secondary program for students was. And this is the basis for a lot of the Florida law also. It said that the term comprehensive transition and post-secondary program for students with intellectual disabilities means a degree, certificate, or non-degree program that is A, offered by an institution of higher education, B, designed to support students with intellectual disabilities who are seeking to continue academic, career and technical, and independent living instruction at an institution of higher education in order to prepare for gainful employment. C, includes an advising and curriculum structure. And D, requires students with intellectual disabilities to participate on not less than a half-time basis as determined by the institution, with such participation focusing on academic components and occurring through one or more of the following activities: regular enrollment in credit-bearing courses with non-disabled students offered by the institution. I'm not sure I like their wording on that. It seems a little backwards, but that's the way they wrote it. Auditing or participating in courses with non-disabled students offered by the institution. Again, it should be auditing courses offered by the institution with non-disabled students. They're kind of messing up their wording. And enrollment in non-credit, non-degree courses with non-disabled students. Participation, and D, participation in internships or work-based training. And it defines student with an intellectual disability as a student with a mental retardation or cognitive impairment characterized by significant limitations in intellectual and cognitive functioning and adaptive behavior as expressed in conceptual, social, and practical skills, who is currently or was formerly eligible for a free appropriate public education under the Individuals with Disability Education Act. So it took the definition from the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities and used that as the definition in federal law for what is an intellectual disability. And it also, here's another part of this law that I did not know, and it might be the basis of part of the Florida law. I'm not sure of that. The second purpose in subpart 2 was to support model demonstration programs that promote successful transition of students with intellectual disabilities. And it emphasized a preference for partnerships with community organizations. And I didn't know this, the requirement for the use of person-centered planning in planning students' educations. So these are all critical things that came out of the Higher Education Opportunity Act that I might not have been aware of had I not been given the opportunity to deliver this presentation, participate in this presentation. That takes us to the Florida Post-Secondary Comprehensive Transition Program Act. And this, they have the link right on the FCSUA website, right on the center website. Does that mean that I read it before in the past? Of course not. We all have many things to do, but I read it this time. And I looked at the purpose and the legislative intent. And we'd all heard the backstory that Senator Gardner had a child with an intellectual disability, and he was motivated to start this program so that these opportunities would be available to students like his child, and open that opportunity for other citizens in Florida in a similar situation. Well, the law describes the purpose and legislative intent is to increase independent living, inclusive and experiential post-secondary education and employment opportunities for students with intellectual disabilities through degree, certificate, or non-degree programs. And here's the part Drew and Janice should be happy about, and to establish statewide coordination of the dissemination of information regarding programs and services for students with disabilities. It was the intent of the legislature that students with intellectual disabilities and students with disabilities have access to meaningful post-secondary education credentials and be afforded the opportunity for a meaningful campus experience. It requires documentation regarding implementation or the presence of an intellectual disability, and describes who can give that documentation. And this is something that you'll hear more about later in the presentation. It created the Florida Center for Students with Unique Abilities at the University of Central Florida to administer applications, grants, and scholarships. Many of you probably know that they're absolutely outstanding at this. And again, I have to give a shout out because poor Janice was on the phone with me till probably after 5 o'clock on the day before things were due to make sure we were able to get this program started. And that's the kind of support we need, especially as we're getting started. It also requires that they consult and collaborate with the National Center and the Coordinating Center. And I'd seen the relationship with Think College, which I'm assuming is that organization, but I did not realize that that was a requirement under the law, nor did, and I still need to learn about this, did I realize that there is a requirement to consult and collaborate with the Florida Talent Development Council to identify meaningful credentials for FPCTPs and to engage businesses and stakeholders to promote experiential training and employment opportunities for students with ID. And their third purpose is to provide technical assistance, which is why we're having this webinar today. It's why we have the various institutes. So as you can see, if you read the law, they're doing what they're expected to do. Okay, now the third piece of and I'm going to take these a little bit out of order, is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. What it does is, it was, as I mentioned, it's the first Disability Civil Rights Act enacted in the United States. It prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities and programs that receive federal financial assistance, and sets the stage for enactment of the Americans with Disability. And it works together with the ADA and IDEA to protect children and adults with disabilities from exclusion, and unequal treatment in schools, jobs, in the community. Okay, so that takes us to the granddaddy of them all, I guess, as far as for adults, which is the Americans with Disability Act. I believe this was signed. Matter of fact, I don't believe it. I know it. So why should I be modest? This was enacted in 1990 also, the same year as this reauthorization of IDEA that required transition components. And what ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, does is it prohibits private employers, state and local governments, employment agencies and labor unions from discriminating against qualified individuals with disabilities in job application procedures, hiring, firing, advancement, compensation, job training, and other terms, conditions, and privileges of employment. And it covers employers with 15 or more employees, both governmental organizations and private organizations. There are a few exclusions to it. Like, for instance, I believe government buildings are excluded from the accessibility requirements. Some government buildings are, and military bases. It also identifies who a person with a disability is and defines that person as someone with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, that has a record of such an impairment, or who is regarded as having such an impairment. But the person must be able to perform the essential functions of the job. If they can, the employer is required to perform reasonable accommodations, as long as these don't require impose an undue hardship that would make it impossible for them to do that. The reasonable accommodations could include things like making existing facilities readily accessible and usable by people with disabilities. It could include things like job restructuring or modifying work schedules or reassigning to vacant positions. Or it could include modifying or acquiring adaptive equipment or devices, adjusting or modifying exams, training materials, or policies, and providing readers or interpreters when necessary. So these are all things that very much interplay with what we do when we're designing job placements for internships or seeking employment, looking at how we design these jobs and the accommodations we require. Our basis for doing this is all in the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, here's an important thing leading into the next slide, and this leads directly into it, is that an employer generally does not have to provide reasonable accommodations unless the person with the disability asks for it. We move to the next slide, please. Okay, this is the huge difference between K-12 and higher education, is entitlement versus eligibility. Kids in the K-12 systems are entitled to a free, appropriate public education with zero rejects. If they're between the ages of 3 and 21, they're entitled to this, and it's just not even a question. Going back, now I said I would mention it, the Mills versus DC Board of Mills versus the DC Board of Education. This was a court case in 1972 because on behalf of students with behavior disorders that were excluded from attending public schools. And whereas Park case said that we have to educate all kids with intellectual disability, the Mills versus DC said we have to do it with kids with all disabilities. If you're going to educate kids with one type, we have to educate kids with every type of disability. But it went further than that, and it feeds right into the entitlement. It required the Washington, D.C. Board of Education to rent billboards, to run newspaper ads, to engage in all kinds of other practices called child find in order to find children with disabilities. And schools are still doing this now. They have to actively seek every child with a disability within their jurisdiction and make sure that they're getting them, as opposed the child is entitled and the district has to provide it. The services are documented within an individualized educational plan, is determined by the IAT team, and it's funded by a school district. Once kids get to college, once they exit the K-12 system, that doesn't work anymore. They now have to meet the requirements for the agency, but even if they meet the requirements, they may not get the services. For instance, we all have more applicants than we're able to accept in our programs, and these applicants may meet the requirements, but we don't have to accept them. They have to be eligible, but that doesn't mean we get them. So that has to do with funding, staffing, whatever. So that is where I am going to pass the ball to my very able companion and interject from this point only if she instructs me to.
Well, thank you, Doug, for doing a great job going over the K-12 system, the legislation. I think that's really important to kind of give us the framework and the laws that support all of our programs here in Florida. I did want to mention another one that popped into my head is an upcoming one in Florida related to the Florida Center for Students with Unique Abilities, and for middle schools to start doing transition planning for the students then, so that they are aware of the post-secondary opportunities sooner and earlier and can plan for that. So just keep that in mind as we all recruit for our programs, is that is going to be another push for students to apply for programs and have access to the programs that are in their areas. So I'm going to go to the next slide. And I'm just going to present the information as it is, and then we'll kind of talk through it more specifically. But Doug mentioned Think College is the national coordinating center. And from their website, they do have eligibility guidelines that focus on motivation, interest, the desire of the applicant to go to college to be the driving force in admissions, rather than academic or skill performance. So the link to their website is here, and it's in the PowerPoint if you wanted to go read it and learn more. But in general, they're mentioning entrance should not be restrictive in nature, but should be constructed to determine the desire to go to college, that it should be not to be dependent on prerequisites or an IQ. Said applicants may be interviewed as part of the admissions process to determine what the students want to do, their motivation and goals, and to determine if it's a good match between the student and the program. So Think College recommends not using a GPA from high school or having a minimum reading level as part of the entry criteria. And then more specifically, for the Florida Post-Secondary Comprehensive Transition Program Act, outlines that applicants would submit to the eligible institution a documentation regarding their intellectual disability, and also to physically attend the institute. Again, the link is there if you wanted to peruse the legislation more thoroughly. So in soliciting from a lot of different programs, I wanted to go over some of the common criteria. So we looked at the legislation, we looked at the guidelines from Think College and FCSUA, so kind of looking at what programs do, and then going into some of the considerations that you may have for your own program. So documentation regarding an intellectual disability. So that is up to the institution to determine what that appropriate documentation is and the eligibility requirements and process. So it does need to be completed by a licensed evaluator that outlines, the diagnosis and potential services or accommodations. But then some programs might have a requirement of that evaluation to be completed within the past 3 years or the past 5 years, or to be completed as the applicant is an adult rather than evaluations from K-12. So some programs may accept IEPs, other programs may not. So again, it's kind of up to the institution. So common eligibility criteria, age. So programs may have an open age range and feature the post-secondary option for any student 18 years or older. Other programs may focus on that young adult population who are just exiting K-12 with an age range of like 18 to 24 years old. So just keeping in mind that FPCTPs, many did not exist 5 years ago for students who graduated then. So age can be another diversity factor to consider for your applicant pool. Motivation and goals. So the applicant has an understanding that college is work. It is a lot of fun and a lot of new experiences and very meaningful, but it does have work and commitment to the time requirements for your program to complete it with success. And a lot of that comes with having upfront conversations about the suitability of the student's goals with what the program offers, or if there are more appropriate options to help a student reach their goal. So some just considerations, like if the student already has a job, can the program assist with a job change or upskilling? If the applicant does not have a job, do they have the motivation for a job during the program and or after the program? So making sure the applicant's goal and the program's goal, which is employment, are comparable and can be suitable for a win-win. Independence and self-determination. So for the applicant to be able to function independently as an adult in the adult settings of a college campus or potentially an off-campus internship without the use of maybe some of the services of K-12 that might have included like personal aides or companions. So maybe some questions could be, does a student expect to complete their own coursework, or do they rely too heavily on others to complete it for them or to give them a pass? Is the student able to make their own legal decisions, or is there a guardian, advocate, or power of attorney? If so, what decisions can the student make? And that kind of does tie into the support system. So who within the student support system is able to support them in an appropriate way? So do parents and guardians understand student expectations? Do they understand FERPA and its implications for how we as a college can communicate with them or not communicate with them? Is the applicant a client of VR or APD or other agencies to offer collaborative services and supports? And that could go back into the partnership that Doug mentioned too in the legislation. Communication, can the applicant express their thoughts, their goals, and advocate for themselves rather than relying on maybe a parent or guardian to voice answers? Can the student use a cell phone or email to communicate? Can they communicate when they need help or if they have questions? Or are those skills that your program is able to help the student build upon? So NTACT, it's a link, I think at the end of the slide, but they have some predictors of success in the post-secondary and employment field. So I'd really advocate for looking at that if you're looking for just some factors to keep in mind in addition to the ones we already mentioned, like motivation, independence, communication, and support system. And I'm going to advance to the next slide. So looking at student admissions, kind of what that process looks like as you're determining eligibility and meeting the criteria. So do applicants apply to only the program? Do they apply to the institution itself? Or do they do both type of applications? Letters of recommendation. I know my program does that, and so does Doug's, like looking for input and perspective from the applicant's teachers, mentors, supervisors to give additional perspective on the student and their goals, their interests, their strengths and capabilities. And then if you do have, if you do accept students who have guardians, to look at that documentation from the court to kind of understand the parameters and still work with the college policies and your program policies. So in general, like what key information do you or your admissions committee need to make an admissions decision? How do you gauge the student's interest, their motivation, their current skill level, their level of maturity, and how you can get that information from applications, from recommendation letters, and from interviews. I think Mr. Rand mentioned y'all had an open house this week or last week. So that can be another consideration when you're looking at applicants, is to bring them to your program, kind of get a feel for how they interact with one another or with your staff, and can do those observations in-house before you accept students. I know many programs do interviews, so how are parents involved in that? Do you interview the parents separately from the student? That's what we do at TCC. And we have an admissions committee as well to go through that. So an open house, some programs might do like the first semester as a trial semester before they admit students into like the full-blown program. And then acceptance into the Institute of Higher Ed and the program policies. So do the students and parents understand the student code of conduct, or if you have your own like program code of conduct, do they understand those policies? And that this applicant, if they're admitted, would be underneath those policies for the college and the program. Some programs like mine do have a memorandum of understanding that goes over, this is our program, this is what we do, these are the expectations for the student, these are the expectations of the supporter, and that's part of our application. Doug, did you have other things to chime in for this slide?
One of the things to think about, and if there's time later that maybe other members of our, that are in this webinar can share their experiences, is differentiating as you're determining who to accept. Which students are there because they want to be there? Which students are there because their parents are pushing them to be there? How do you make that distinction? How do you make the distinction to parents between the difference of their role? And I've never met Lyman Dukes, but I think he's up at USF. I think he's in that program, and they came down and did a good session for us explaining that difference to parents. How do you do all these things? Because it really is critical. I'm a big believer that you can teach anyone that wants to learn, but it's impossible to teach anybody that doesn't want to learn. And so, I think those are just things that it would be interesting to hear about if we have time later.
Yeah, if anyone from the audience wants to unmute or type in the chat, and then if you have thoughts or how your program does.
And another thing I'm curious about is the types of components that people have in their memorandums of understanding with parents. What types of things are we doing to distinguish, again, what is the parent's responsibility? What is the student's? I know one of the things that our coordinators have worked very hard on, and it seems like they've achieved success, is explaining to parents that we don't want them helping with homework, because college students never get help from their parents with their homework. And if the parents are helping them with work at home, we're not able to adequately assess what the student's abilities are. And we want the work to be so that it's challenging for a student. I'm sure everybody in this room has had the experience of achieving something that you didn't think was possible, and the great feeling then you get from doing that. And you all know about the zone of proximal development, where we pace work at a level that it's just a little bit more difficult than a child can do without some assistance. And that's where we want structure to be. So how do we define these boundaries with parents so that, they're supporting their student, but not in a way that interferes with the student's ability to gain education and independence, or interferes with our ability to assess them? Marlene, what do you think? Marlene's not going to talk to me. Marlene, I'm a charming, nice guy. You can talk to me. Joanna will talk to me. I know. I can see from the look on her face. Tell me, Joanna, about your experience.
You can see from the look on my face that we haven't started our program yet. So, hey.
Well, what are you anticipating as the challenges, and how do you anticipate dealing?
I do anticipate a challenge with parents letting go and letting students be adults.
What ideas do you have on how to deal with that? Because your experiences in life are different from mine. So, you know things I don't know.
I mean, we are brand new, but here's what, I guess what I'm thinking is it's going to take a lot of communication with the parent, with the guardian, with the student, teaching the students to be more independent. But I guess in my case, my role will be kind of talking the parents off the ledge a lot of the time. So, and that's what I plan to do. I have phone calls to make now. We had our first open house yesterday, and I'm gonna contact all of the parents and students who were there, and just kind of talk about, just gradually kind of let them know what expectations are.
Somebody just posted in a chat a question, so can we discuss guardianship? And I'm going to, and folks, feel free to disagree with me, because if we all agree, there's no point in talking. And my opinions are sometimes a little bit on the radical edge. And I need to be reeled back in on occasion. So, but when we get to the area of guardianship and the role of parents and things like this, we just started this year too. And at the beginning of the year, going into this role of wanting to have students who are motivated to do things on their own and parents who are motivated to let them do that. We had a lot of parent calls about things, and we found it necessary to stress that we cannot talk about this. And my approach is that if parents absolutely need to be involved, then they need to get a FERPA waiver. And there's information on how to do that on the website. And that would be the guidance I would provide. If it's that important to you to get between us and the student, then we're going to let you do the legwork to find that. Now, we want to reassure parents, and it's going to be very interesting. I give you a heads up here, Drew and Janice, because we just sent out our first parent satisfaction surveys today, and the first student satisfaction surveys go out tomorrow. But one of our concerns, and that we've tried to express to parents, is that we simply, now that their students are in college, we don't talk to them about academic issues or matters covered by FERPA. And that's not a matter of us being mean. That's a matter of federal law. That is something that they need to address with their legislatures if they have a problem with it. And we've tried to do this. We've tried to do this in a way that it's delicate at first, but making it clear that this is, again, it's not a matter of us being mean. This is a matter of federal law. They have entrusted their child for us to bridge them to that period of becoming increasingly independent. And so they need to actually entrust us with that in our relationship with the child, and know that when there are serious issues that we can talk to them about that don't involve violating the law, we will be sure to do that. You're saying that here we have another question from Joanna as to whether or not if a parent has legal guardianship, the child may not be appropriate for the most part. I'll give you my opinion on this, and maybe Amanda will share hers, and then others if they want. But I try never to penalize a child for the behavior of their parents. And sometimes the parent is asserting that that guardianship, they've gotten that guardianship when the child would prefer that they hadn't, but the parent was better able to prevail in that situation. So I wouldn't say that in 100%, I would look at this on a case-by-case basis. If a student needs guardianship because they're not safe independently on campus or in the community, there's a safety issue, then at that point, I would think maybe that would be a factor that we would consider. I remember working in a high school, though, where we took kids to Disney and Epcot, high school kids with behavior disorders. And we put them in motel rooms with roommates overnight. We put tape on the outside of the door. Everybody had a great time, except for one student whose mother insisted on coming with him and being his roommate. And I regret to this day that I allowed that to happen, because he was deprived of a very good opportunity. And so I can't say that legal guardianship would preclude accepting a student, but I would look at it and wonder why. Drew's got-
Yeah.
Can I go ahead? Go ahead, Drew.
Right. What I want to share is that, guardianship is that is a huge topic. And there are many, many levels of guardianship. And so I don't think we can just say guardianship. Because and right now, can I spill all those levels? I can't spill off the top of my head all of those levels, but it depends on the need of, hopefully it's depending on the needs of that individual student based on that family's decision, what areas of that child's, that young adult's life, that the guardianship. So yes, that's very important. And we have some information on our website about guardianship. That's another topic that we want to have another webinar on to really talk about guardianship, and how guardianship plays a role in all of this. And another thing, Doug, you've done such a great job of where you've talked about the K-12 system to the post-secondary system. If anything, what I keep hearing being said is this is why it's vitally important that you have a connection with the K-12 systems in your area that are providing where your students are coming from. Because truly, guardianship is something that should be addressed before students leave K-12. Whenever a student reaches the age, they get a notice at age 17 that they're going to reach the age of majority in 1 year. In 1 year, there's a requirement that they get another notice that they have reached the age of majority. And along with that needs to come some information to parents and to families, especially whenever you're thinking about preparing for post-secondary education. It's sort of like whenever you're talking about just transition in general. It's a little overwhelming because there are so many areas and there are so many levels, and what one person does at one point in that pathway impacts multiple people farther down the road. So all very good points, but I think we've had a really good discussion talking about guardianship, but we'll definitely have a webinar on guardianship and the different levels of guardianship. But I did want to share that, you know, we just can't say guardianship and everybody. It's one of those things like saying, and I don't know what other word might be associated, but there's a lot of different meanings to and levels to guardianship.
What I was going to add is that from Robert Morgan, what we do with Project TOPS is the first thing that we request from any parent, caregiver, or student. The first thing we ask is, are you the guardian? And there's a lot of misconception with parents. Well, yeah, I'm the guardian. I pay the bills. I feed him. I buy his clothes. No, that's not a guardianship. So we have to explain it. And we've had workshops here with attorneys for parents, because a lot of them are very misinformed on what the concept is of guardianship and the different levels. Yes, we do have students who do have, parents do have guardianship, or their foster parent, grandparent. And no, that does not mean that that student is not, that young adult is not capable of being in our program. That leads us again to for another first thing we have our students do, whether they are qualified candidates or not for Project TOPS, is they need to sign the release of information or release of documentation forms. Because they are young adults, they need to give us permission to be able to talk to the parents, to be able to talk to the vocational rehab consultant, or whoever they think whoever they give us permission to speak to. So there's two forms that we have, one for Project TOPS and one that Robert Morgan has, the student services. So that takes care of that exchange of information, because we make it quite clear to parents, this is not high school anymore. Your child or your young adult is an adult. So we need to have permission from that adult to be able to speak to you. That also leads us to the perceptions that we have with parents, especially from coming from high school to Robert Morgan Technical College, is that this is, we are an all-inclusive program. We're not self-contained. So they need to realize that we do not modify, we do not modify our curriculum. We can accommodate the curriculum based on their 504s, but that's something else that some of our parents will not understand. Basically, what I call is cutting the cord, cutting the umbilical cord. Know your child, you cannot drop him off and sit by the door and wait for him and peer through the windows. He's a young adult and he needs to be independent enough. In a program for us, that's we go by a curriculum led by the Florida Department of Education. So that's our experience so far.
I'd like to throw out another thought that came to me based on what I had to learn as part of this presentation. And that is that the Higher Education Opportunity Act requires the use of person-centered planning to plan the educational programs. Every person-centered planning approach that I'm familiar with emphasizes that the student is at the center of the planning, obviously, ergo the name, and that they're going to determine who the participants are. So that's one key area where the student pretty much has to be the decision maker for us to comply. But I want to bring up another point too, and that is when I talk about being, and I don't want to sound like I'm aggressive with parents and that, you know, this is federal law and you need to write to your congressman and all, because we have an approach, we try and emphasize an approach where we always see the best in people. And when we get into the eligibility versus being accepted, we have many more applicants that are eligible than are accepted. And sometimes parents can be very upset when they call and want to know why their student wasn't accepted. And we have to view that as a compliment. They're recognizing that we have something of value to offer, and they're disappointed that they're not able to take advantage of it. So their anger, it may come out as anger or frustration on their point, but we should hear that as a compliment and respond respectfully to it. The other thing is we need to understand the motivation of parents. And as I look around, I see me, Lyman, Peter, and I see, it appears from the names that almost everybody here is a female. Many women have had children. And when you're looking forward to having a child, you think the first utmost priority for you is you want a child that's healthy and happy. You don't care that they're not president of the United States. You want them to be healthy and happy. Well, our parents have children that have had disabilities, and their entire lives they love those children and they're concerned about them and they want to protect them. So even when there's parents who are sometimes behaving in ways that we might consider interfering with our ability to provide independence, there is something that is their motivation is good. It's to ensure the safety of a child that they love and care about and want the best for. And it's helpful for us to remember that. I just saw another comment about case trial semesters, and Amanda and I spoke about this yesterday. And we wrote into our grant application guaranteed success rates, retention rates, graduation rates. So we at FPCTPs are not doing trial semesters. We take you, we are committed to your success and doing whatever. I'm not sure what other programs are doing though. And it might be helpful if someone that does do that type of thing thinks it feels comfortable speaking up about it and informing the rest of us.
I think like, I don't know exactly what program, but maybe like some that start in the summer and do like a couple classes or more hands-on things. They do the person-centered planning in the summer, and then they can see like, is this a fit based on the student's interests, their goals, you know, as we learn about the student a little bit more, you know, would they progress to be fully enrolled in the program? So I know Doug mentioned they do not have a trial semester. We do not either, but just like presenting different ideas or suggestions for people to consider for their own.
I would ask this while we seem to have a few minutes left and we seem to have covered the topic of eligibility and for programs. While we've got people with the different perspectives here, does anybody have any cutting edge issues that they'd like to bring up to get a variety of opinions on, something that's troubling them right at the moment that they might be able to get opinions from Amanda or anyone else in the audience as to how to address it or how others are addressing it, so that your time is used in a way that is most meaningful for you?
I think just another thing to mention is, like you mentioned, Doug, maybe having too many applicants and how to have a non-acceptance notice. I know we have done that last year, but did admit the student this year. And I do think within that year, that student did have more opportunities to grow and mature. That was helpful to then come to like a college setting. Sometimes it just might not be the right time to be, in college. So I think just like another consideration.
What we have done is we try to tell people, we've done a few things. One is we're trying to tell people right off the bat. In our first year, we had problems before we opened up getting our website open. We got 40 applications in under a month for 10 spots. And so we're always going to have more applicants than we have room. So we are telling people as they apply, you need to understand that there is a shortage of spots. The other thing that we're doing is we are telling people that we are not going to review any applications. This is not a first come, first served process. This is one where when applications are closed, then we will review them all at the same time so that everything is as fair as can possibly be. There's no preference for working at FGCU. There's no preference for being Drew's cousin. Unfortunately, if he had a cousin in need, it's going to be who we think we are best situated to make a positive difference in their life. And then the last thing we're doing, and I've been working on this recently, by having the students in one of my graduate courses, is providing resources, listing of other community resources that may be appropriate or available to those students that we cannot accept. Because there are many deserving students that need help that we can't serve. If we can't help them, that doesn't mean we can't tell them who may be able to, so that they don't feel completely, just brokenhearted. Because the reality is, we're like every other organization. We have an unlimited supply of need and a limited capacity to meet it. And if you doubled our capacity, we would still be in the same position. So we try and do as much good as we can for as many people as we can, whenever we can.
Doug, is there another slide coming up?
Yeah, I have a couple more slides, but
Yeah, there's still some more slides, I think.
the conversations.
I just don't want us to run out of time.
I think this one was just continuing about enrollment as far as which systems or what applications are completed, and then what enrollment systems, if the program uses the college LMS system, if students register for classes like their peers, do they attend the student orientation with peers? Is there a supplemental one? Is there a specialized one? Are students registered with the Disability or Accessibility Services Office? And then the preparation for faculty and staff for teaching the students. I know, like for our program, we have the students in the college classes, so I tend not to put more than 1 or 2 students in one class. So that can also be a limiting factor, like Doug said, of just not having enough spots for students, depending on the class and the teacher, can be another, consideration. And then this was just more considerations as we've been talking through, a lot of the conversation has come up, considerations for K-12 versus post-secondary, a lot of those conversations of differences, the parent and student roles, like having those really upfront and honest conversations as soon as you can, to try to help eliminate a lot of maybe the misconceptions or the expectations that aren't reached, and that leads to disappointment for everyone. So depending on the type of credential that your program offers, if there's different eligibility, like Robert Morgan, they have the same curriculum that the student needs to progress through, whereas, other programs might be a little bit more flexible with modifications in the college classroom. So that could be another factor to consider. We talked about the student versus parent motivation. Is it the parent pushing it for a goal that they have for their child, or is it really the student who has that motivation and that why I'm in college to continue to persevere through, the 2 years, the 3 years, however long your program is. Talked about guardianship, so I guess stay tuned for a webinar on that. It's coming up. And then, Doug has also mentioned safety concerns of, our program has mentors, but they're not companions or personal aides. If the student gets lost, is it going to be like a total meltdown? Are they going to be able to ask for help? So being able to communicate, navigate, have their own transportation arrangements. And then the component for residential, I think, is a big one too. We don't have residential, but I know, Doug, you're looking at that option too, as far as considerations for maybe being admitted into the program, but depending on eligibility, maybe not admitted into the housing options. And then I guess these are some programs from the HUVA conference that I requested information from in the chat. So if it is inaccurate now, I apologize, but these are just what I pulled as far as what different programs require for documentation. So you can see it's a little bit different as far as maybe requiring one or two things or many things. And then here are some resources from Department of Education and NTAC, which is a National Technical Assistive Center for Transition that has those predictive factors. And then our contact information. And then, I guess, are there any other questions or comments to bring up before we wrap up the session?
If you have any questions, this is your chance to ask Amanda or ask Doug. Feel free to unmute yourself, or you can write a question in the chat. There's also an evaluation that I think has been put in the chat for today's webinar. If you would, please, click on that, and you'll also be receiving an email with today's PowerPoint slides, as well as the evaluation. Please complete the evaluation and let us know. This has been very informative, very helpful. It's great to hear from folks in the field. Doug, I'm so happy to know that you've read the Florida Post-Secondary Comprehensive Transition Program Act. It's very well written, isn't it, Doug?
I keep telling people I can't wait for the day that I retire and I quit correcting grammar on newspaper people on television and everything. One of the bad things about this job is it forces you to be we tend to be very critical. We look at, and so I tend to adapt that and everything. And I would like someday to go back to just being a nice guy. And if someone tells me, you know, that they know the King of England, I can say, oh, that's nice, and believe them. So.
But I do encourage everyone, please, and as Doug has said, you know, read the legislation, because everything we're doing is from the legislation. What we're doing is following the legislation, and it set out a plan, and that's what we're trying to fulfill to give students all these wonderful opportunities. I want to thank those people that have added and asked questions and added information today, because it's always great to hear from other programs. We wish you all a happy holiday, a Merry Christmas. For those of you who may be have just celebrated Hanukkah, that you had a wonderful holiday, as it's a time where we all hopefully will have a little bit of a break before we start a new year, 2022. That's hard for me to imagine. It's like, how can it be 2022? But it is, and we're offering more and more students opportunities. And you know, thank you all for sharing this information about eligibility at two great programs. And now that we are beginning to be able to see each other face to face and not just virtually, I hope that you all will take advantage of visiting one another and be able to visit one another's programs, because every time we hear from another program, I think we learn something new. Something that we can improve each other's program. I certainly share a lot of information from one program to the next. So if there aren't any other questions, thank you all for being here today, and please complete the evaluation. Thank you, Doug, and thank you, Amanda. Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.
You have a good afternoon.
Thanks for the opportunity.